Welcome to Creative Conversations with Roger Humphrey, the fine arts podcast where I get to talk with composers, performers, authors, visual artists, filmmakers, and others in the arts. Before we begin, please hit the like, follow, or subscribe buttons. It's a very easy thing to do, and it goes a long way towards supporting the channel, and it really does help a lot. Hey, if you or someone you love plays guitar or ukulele, please consider visiting my website at www.rogerhumphrey.com and looking at the many things I have to offer. Much of it's for free. If you like what you see, please take a moment to subscribe. I promise, I won't send you any spam, just occasional updates. And we are welcoming to the show Edward Klorman, who's a violist and an author, and Inbal Megiddo, who's a cellist, and we will be joined later, we hope, by Brad DeRoche, who is a wonderful classical guitarist, and we're going to have a conversation today about the Bach Cello Suites. Suites for unaccompanied cello, written by Bach somewhere between 1717 and 1723, I think. And the reason for that is that Ed Klorman has written this wonderful book that does a deep dive on these. And Inbal has just released a wonderful album where she's recorded all six. That had to have been a chore. And Brad is his label has asked him to transcribe or arrange them for guitar, and he's in the process of doing that. And he is also recording these. So I thought it would be kind of fun to get into these suites by J.S. Bach from three different perspectives. So let's get started a little bit. First off, Inbal, I have a question for both of you right now, and I'll start with Inbal. Ladies first. What about these suites really attracted you to the point where you really felt like you wanted to record them?
The suites for cellists, they're kind of like the Bible of the cello. It's something that we are really aware of from basically the moment you pick up an instrument. They are, I started when I was 2 with a Suzuki method. They're already in that first book in Suzuki. So it's just really something that I've grown with. They've grown with me, and I think they mean so many different things to so many different people that it is really a vehicle for being able to express yourself and connect to this really amazing set of works, and actually bring it to audiences today. I think there's a way to make them relevant to today, and while also connecting us to the past. So there is something very special about those suites, and that's really why I actually wanted to actually put them down and record them, and I thought, I was able to share something.
Thank you. And Ed, I would the same question. What do you find about them so compelling that you really wanted to do such a deep dive and write about them?
Yeah, well, my story is similar. I started on Suzuki violin and later switched to viola. In one of the early Suzuki books, you play ya-pa-pum, ba-da-dum. It's a piece many kids, many parents of children who learn violin or cello might recognize. So these are pieces we really grow up with. And for those of us who play and also teach, a lot of our students play them. They're pieces that raise so many questions. You use the instrument in many different ways. You play melodies, you play chords, you play a melody and a bass line at the same time. So it really challenges you. How do you get different colors and shapes from the instrument? How can you imply an instrument that's doing more than it seems like a cello is able to do by itself? So it challenges you intellectually and musically, and they're pieces we live with from sort of our earliest stage all the way through our careers. Some musicians like Yo-Yo Ma or Janos Starker produced 3, 4, or 5 public professional recordings of them. Unlike the solo violin pieces, there's a lot of questions that have answers to them, like exactly what year were they written, exactly which notes did Bach write, exactly which slurs did he write, which tell us, what bowings to play. The cello suites, there's so many questions, and every teacher you play them for has a different opinion. And so I really wanted to figure out, where do we kind of know answers to some of the questions, and where are there different ways of looking at it? Could I guide a reader through some of these different choices or different sort of mysteries surrounding these pieces?
That's wonderful. Yeah, I know that for me, I came to classical music in general late in life. I was in my 20s. But I remember as a teenager, a friend of mine, I used to listen to classical music. I just never attempted to play it. And a friend of mine gifted me the Pablo Casals recordings, the full set. And I didn't. I knew I liked Bach, but I didn't know why. I just really wasn't that. I didn't know very much at all. And I sat and I listened to it, and the records were scratchy and old. And once my ears got used to that less than desirable sonic sound, that just the recording, I listened and I was just absolutely sucked in. Now I've got to believe that you're both familiar with the Casals.
Yes, yeah.
And so,
Yeah. Just to add on what Ed was talking about, I think because there is so much written about the suites, and they're held in such a esteem, rightfully so. There can be a lot of rigidity as well about how people approach them, and that's one of the things that I actually wanted in my approach and when making the recordings, was actually to try to get away from that and see how what we can do to make it fresh, and give students, give anybody who's working on these pieces the license to actually try to find out what else you can, how else you can see them, what else you can bring to them, and that the magical thing about it is because we actually don't have a real manuscript in the composer's hand. That extra veil between you and the composer gives us a lot of freedom.
So we've got Brad trying to sign in now. Yay! But let's see here. But what's going on here? Anyway,
He's almost here.
Pretty loose around here.
Yeah.
So Ed, you wrote the book. Can you kind of give us a kind of a thumbnail sketch overview of the history and what we know about these
Yeah,
pieces?
well, there's a lot we know and there's a lot we don't know. So, Bach wrote them probably around 1720. We don't really know for sure why he wrote them. He didn't play the cello that we know of, whereas he did play violin in addition to keyboard instruments. We know these are pieces that he shared with his students, that they were interested in getting to know what was possible on a solo violin or solo cello, and that his students held in very high regard. But then, for a long time, people maybe knew of these pieces, but they had never heard them. They weren't published. But then finally, about a century later, they were published. But so far as we know, they weren't really played that much until around 1860. So that's kind of where the history I give picks up, where I was looking at concert reviews and published editions starting from around the 1860s. And what was interesting was a lot of audience didn't really care for this music at first. They thought this music sounded sort of like etudes, which is
Uh-huh.
interesting. They added piano accompaniment, or they even recomposed them to modernize them to adapt to audience taste, which is really different from how we do it today. Then you mentioned Pablo Casals. Of course, he was the musician who really popularized them. I don't think it's right to say that he discovered them, as some people do, because
Right.
there's so many performances that predate him. But he was the one who really made it standard that this is music every cellist should know all six. That for him, if you perform a cello suite, you should perform the entire piece in order with all the repeats and so on. I think he played them over 300 times in public. He
Really?
made the first public recording, yes. And through his teaching and through the recordings, he's influenced several generations of musicians to follow. And then now, there's over 300 recordings of them performed on modern cello, Baroque cello, not to mention recordings and transcriptions for violin, piano, harpsichord, trombone, banjo. So they're really music that have become very popular, and also that have kind of escaped just the rarefied world of classical music, but you hear them in movies, on television, in the film Master and Commander. You hear the prelude to the first cello suite to represent the ocean. In Wednesday, the series on Netflix, where Wednesday Addams plays the cello. If you look closely at the music she's playing from, it's actually the Bach Cello Suites. That's really they've become on Reddit, for example, people talk about that cello song, and what they mean is the prelude to Suite Number One. So this is music that is sort of iconic and recognizable, and that has come to have a lot of meaning besides just in concerts.
So we're welcoming to the conversation Brad DeRoche. Hey, Brad.
Hi.
We're in and recording, so you're gonna get a detention later for me.
Well, if I could make Wi-Fi work in the Appalachian Mountains, I would have been there much sooner.
So the question that I posed our other two guests, and I will pose to you too, is what about the cello suites compelled you to you're in the process of arranging them and transcribing them and recording them. What drew you into these as a guitar player?
First and foremost, just the sheer beauty of them. I find that they are some of the most interesting and beautiful and large-scale solo instrumental works, that along with the violin sonatas and partitas. And so I think for guitarists, and the lute suites, of course, we play those. And for me personally, the cello suites I found to be very different than the other two sets of suites by Bach. And they're much more angular and, to me, again, interesting to use that word, because the harmonies are not filled out for guitar. And so we have to add something to make them sound a little bit fuller on our instrument. And so I was drawn to them early on, played them as a college student, taught them many times, but then I started looking at making my own arrangements of them. And then that changed my appreciation of them a lot when I started making my own arrangements. And so that's where I am in the process. I'm more than halfway through now. I've arranged and recorded the first three. I'm working on the fourth one. So anyway, yeah, it's been a long journey. For most of my career, I've had some contact with them in some way, shape, or form.
Well, now Bach wrote these in between 1717 and 1723. Is that right, Ed?
That's our best guess. The reason we know is the violin pieces we know for sure were 1720, and these were probably finished shortly afterward.
Okay, but how were the Brandenburg Concerti? Were those written during that period too? Do we know?
Around that same time. This was the one time in his life he was in the city of Köthen, working at a Calvinist court. So this is a setting where he wasn't writing church music, where he didn't have the obligation to write a cantata every week and that sort of thing. So he was really writing chamber music, and he wrote concerti, keyboard music. He wrote many, many, many concerti. And at a certain point, when he was maybe thinking of leaving Köthen and he was thinking about other jobs, one thing you might do is collect 6 of your best concerti that show the wide range of kinds of concerti you can write. And he copied them out into a beautiful presentation manuscript and sent them to, I think the title was The Margrave of Brandenburg. So it's a little bit of like a calling card to maybe put out feelers for a work opportunity.
So sonatas and partitas, 3 of each, as a set, played as a set, 6 Brandenburg Concerti, 6 suites for unaccompanied cello. What's with this number 6? Anybody want to jump in on that one? No.
Very common to publish things in sets of 6 or else 3. Like there's 3 gamba sonatas. So this continues. Mozart wrote 6 quartets dedicated to Haydn, for example. So very common to publish things in groups of 6. And maybe for Bach, the idea would be over the course of those 6 pieces, almost like a textbook. How can you show the range of what's possible in a certain genre? So you'll have some pieces in major, some in minor, some that are more virtuosic, some that are more constrained. So almost you could think of it a little bit like an opus collection. Oh. And it's like, here's a range of what I can demonstrate that's possible beyond what you might have imagined a cello could do.
I see. Okay, so nothing mystical.
Well, maybe. Can I throw one thought in here?
Of course.
Bach and numerology, those are often terms that come in the same sentence. And in that point in time, numerology was something that many and educated people were interested in. It was quite common. And the ratios of 1-to-1 times 1-to-2 times 1-to-3, 3 being a Holy Trinity, that adds up to the number 6. And so there's some significance in the number 6 that it had kind of a, we could say, mystical value in that sense, that it could represent the Holy Trinity as well. And so that comes from a book by Ruth Tatlow. She really did an extraordinary survey of Bach and numerology, Bach and numbers. And so anyway, there's probably a lot to the number 6 besides just, hey, I'm going to put out a collection of 6. He was not the only one. For sure, there were others, many others that published sets of 6. So
Now, as we take a look at this now, this is for everybody. We have all 6 of these things. Do we see, are these 6 individual suites, or do we see more of a continuity, some sort of an arc from number 1 through the beginning of number 1 to the end of number 6? Anybody? Any overview?
I can jump in a little bit as a performer. I definitely see the arc. It's and I talked about it. It's in my notes, and I think when we talked last time. There are obviously different ways of interpreting what's going on there, but when I play it, I see that kind of evolution of a person going through their lifespan. For example, we talked about going from suite 1, where it's the childhood, to suite 2 to adolescence, suite 3 early adult, 4 middle age, and 5 old age, and 6 being the beyond. And so it's just really your journey through life, and actually playing all 6 in that way is. By the end, you kind of wish you were in the afterlife at that point. But yeah, it's you really do feel like you're going through a journey. Like I said, I know that there are lots of different ways of looking at it, but that's one. That's
fascinating.
Yeah.
Unlike many other collections by Bach, I think many players would agree, they're pretty much ordered in order of complexity. So the last 3 suites are the most demanding, and maybe the first suite is for instance, the first suite you could think of as introducing the cello in its most natural form, by which I mean it uses a lot of the open strings. That's the most resonant way to play on the cello. So that's different from the violin sonatas and partitas. Also, the cello suites, each of them has exactly the same number of movements. So if you look at the titles and the different types of dances, they all have exactly the same movements, but the first 2 have minuets, the second 2 have bourrées, and then the last 2 have gavottes. So that's one way of thinking about the structure. So you could think of it as 2, 2, and 2 by dance type. But another way to think of it is the first 3 suites are major, minor, major, and the next 3 suites are also major, minor, major. So these might be some ways Bach is thinking about the 6 as a cycle. To add to what Inbal said, I know many cellists who've discussed the cello suites in terms of a journey or in terms of a lifetime. We don't know if that's an idea that we can trace to Bach, but many people who played this music think of it in those terms. And sometimes you hear that expressed almost with Christian ideas. So there are various cellists who've compared suite number 5 to the Crucifixion, specifically the Sarabande music, which is very austere and has these dissonances in it. That's maybe the only movement with 0 double stops or chords. And then also that suite is for a special tuning, so the instrument sounds different. And then the last suite, suite number 6, that's a very brilliant piece in D major, right key, and it's written for a 5-string instrument. So that means the instrument has a wider range, it's more brilliant, it's more virtuoso. So sometimes folks have associate that with the idea of resurrection, of kind of the joyful and the brilliant, and the spectacle as a kind of culmination of the 6 pieces.
Interesting. Well, I've got a couple of technical questions then, if I can jump in the middle of this for a second. Starting with Inbal, that 6th one was written for a 5-string cello. I'm assuming you don't have a fifth string on your instrument, but that's only an assumption on my part. So what challenges did that pose for you?
So that is one of the reasons that sixth suite is a bit more challenging. There are people who perform it on a five-string instrument that have a separate cello for that.
Now is that an extra higher string?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Because on a guitar, if we have like a 7 or 8 string, it's usually lower notes, not higher notes. That's why I asked. Okay.
Yeah. So it's an additional higher string. And it's. I think that kind of, I mean, it's that way. There's probably more resonance to the instrument. There are different challenges in actually trying to cross, having so many string crossings, because and on a wider arc of string crossings. But I don't. I use my regular cello for all of them, which means that we have to imply that there's a sixth string, and so there's a lot of work in higher positions with thumb positions, and when you're actually trying to find fingerings for it. I try to find something that would actually mimic, so that I'm still crossing strings where it would have been if it was a five string instrument, to get that sort of idea. So yeah, so I think that's the biggest thing. You're going way up high on the instrument if you're using a 4-string instrument, and actually while still trying to get that the idea of the freedom of the sound and resonance.
Sure.
So those are the challenges. Being very high up, having probably technically challenging things going on, making it sound like it's simple in first position. But I think that's almost everything that we do is as performers is in that range as well. So
now, Ed, you play viola, and I'm assuming you've played through these on the viola.
Yes.
Now the tuning is the same as a cello, only an octave higher, as I recall.
Correct. Yeah.
What challenges do you have? I mean, you don't have the reaches that she would have, the physical reaches.
So, for example, suite number 4 begins with this big leap from low E flat to high E flat. On viola, here's the low E flat and here's the high E flat. You just put this finger down. Whereas on cello, you have to shift, if I'm not mistaken, after the first note of every measure. So there are some things that are easier on viola. Cello is a bigger instrument. It rings more. So if I'm playing a bass note and then a high note, maybe the cello, you're hearing the bass note longer, but it's accompanying the high notes you play afterward. And on viola, we're always trying to aspire toward the resonance that a cello has, but it can be harder. I play on both a modern and a Baroque instrument, so those do some things differently. And then what you were just discussing with suite number 6. So the first violist ever to perform all 6 cello suites and make a recording, her name was Lillian Fuchs. She played the 6th suite mostly in the original key. So on a cello, when you're doing that, what Inbal was describing, thumb position, you're reaching, I'm not sure if you can see it on the screen, down like this. On a viola, you're reaching around like that. It's very, 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 very difficult. So most violas today transpose the piece down a fifth, play it in G major, so it's in a friendlier position and the instrument rings more. But Lillian Fuchs played it mostly in D major, and it's an extraordinary feat. She actually was invited to play for Casals. The version of the story I've heard is sort of like the feeling was he was a little skeptical. Could this little lady make these pieces sound so great on viola when they're supposed to be for cello? And she traveled to Prague in France where Casals was living, and she played suite number 6, the most technically demanding one, and she's playing up in this high register. And when she finally finished, he was silent and said, well, on viola, it sounds better. That's the story, anyway, as told by Lillian Fuchs' students, as I've heard it.
What a lovely story. So you, on the viola and also on the cello, you have the difficulty of trying to create some sort of sense of polyphony or harmony as you go through these. Brad, on the guitar, it's not a big deal. We've got that option. It's a little easier on the guitar. The problem with the guitar, and you indicated earlier, is that it sounds a little thin.
Yeah, it certainly can. If we play single notes, we don't have obviously the ability to use dynamics to swell a note. So as soon as we pluck it, it immediately begins to die. And so if we go from note to note, we're constantly losing volume on notes. And so a lot of times I add a bass line mostly just a bass line, to fill out the harmony and to create a little bit more sustain. Otherwise, because again, we're a plucked string instrument, so when we pluck, the note starts to die, and it can start to sound thin as a result. The converse of that is to what most guitarists do with this music is they try to turn each of the 6 suites into the equivalent of a lute suite, which Bach did for the 5th suite. That's also Lute Suite 995 in
Right.
G minor. And so Bach added quite a few harmonies to it. And so guitarists use that as their model. But my approach to it has been different because I've always thought that the arrangements that people make of Bach's music, cello suites or a violin, starts to sound more like the arranger. And so what happens, for instance, when Segovia made his version of the Chaconne and performed it, it was a great big deal back in 1924. And so what happened, I think, was he put a lot of extra notes in the piece, filled up chords and so forth.
Right.
And so I've always thought of that as the Segovia Bach Chaconne, because he's as much an author of the music as Bach was. And so my approach has been to try to stay out of the way as much as I can and really offer very simple, usually single note basses to fill up a measure, to keep harmonies going. And I also tried to sustain notes by playing them across strings as much as I can, instead of, if it's a linear passage, a scalar passage, that's different. But for instance, if you look at the beginning of the 4th cello suite with the arpeggios there, we can sustain those notes and play them and have them all ring together quite easily, which I do. And so, yeah, we try to make it as harmonious as possible, but then also follow the music. When it's a linear passage, a melodic passage, then I try not to add too much to it, because I feel like then it becomes the DeRoche Bach Cello Suites, and I'd rather just have them be the Bach Cello Suites played on guitar.
So how have the cello and slash viola transcriptions varied from the time of Casals, or at least the fingerings, to what you're hearing today? Has there been an evolution there?
I was just going to add to what Brad said, and then to get
sure,
to that,
by all means,
if it's
please.
okay. We know from some of Bach's students, who were mostly keyboard players and organists, that he used his violin sonatas and partitas with them, and they report that he often played them on the keyboard, fleshing out the harmony as much as he deemed necessary. In other words, he did something like what Brad was just describing when he played them for keyboard. One of the manuscript copies of the cello suites, the one the cellist called Source B, was made by someone who didn't play the cello and probably only a little bit played violin. So this was probably made to be used on organ or on keyboard or for teaching purposes. But yeah, how have things evolved since Casals? Well, I mean, if you look at almost any edition of the cello suites from the past century, the notes are mostly the same. There are a few spots where there are some note discrepancies. What differs a lot are the slurs. And that makes a big difference. Is the prelude to the first suite or so it's hard to sing, or the climax of the 3rd cello suite, is it or is that sort of thing. So performances can sound very different because of those choices. Bach wrote very little to give us a clue about tempo, almost no dynamics. So those are also choices that vary a lot. Yeah, if the question is about how do the editions vary, maybe there's a trend toward editions that have a little bit less written in them. Urtext editions that aspire to give you only what the composer wrote and nothing else. Of course, we don't know what the composer wrote because we don't have his autograph. So that makes this a little bit challenging. And it might be a reason why a student comes to a lesson and their edition has different markings than their teacher's does. And how do we navigate that? That's a problem or a question. Or maybe it's an opportunity, as Inbal put it, that we have more choice.
Inbal, were you able to reconcile your fingerings with other published fingerings that you've worked with?
So I'm going to say, I think a lot of the additions that were made up until now have been made by men with big hands.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's I think that's actually an issue for a lot of repertoire, cello repertoire. And my hand is not huge, so I think that actually. I mean, there are two things. I mean, one, I do actually kind of ascribe to what Ed was talking about. Was there is no actual manuscript, no autograph, and that gives me the freedom to actually create something that works for me. And my job is to make it as authentic to myself and the composer, and make it beautiful for the audience to hear it. So, in order to do that, I find the fingerings that work best for me. And I actually start off from a blank score. I don't look at the additions. And I looked at that as an actually huge teaching opportunity for students to really work their way through something and find their own way. And my way changes through time as well. It's not
sure.
None of it is set, and nothing that your students deciding that a slur has to happen in one place and feeling really strongly about it, and then presenting it and managing to bring that out. I think is just as authentic and part of their journey as any other one, which is that, and that's the marvelous thing about these suites. They're incredible pieces of music, and we have the freedom. And what I was saying, before, it's so hard because they're such masterpieces that there's this tradition, and people want to say, oh no, the Bach suites have to be played this way, yeah. And here we go. There's a guitar version, a viola version. Ed, do you know about I think it was Laszlo Varga who did the the E major suite in G major. He transcribed.
No. Okay.
Yeah, I know. And then you can actually let the cello ring, and instead of playing in E flat, and having it. A different kind of color.
I think people who don't play music, and particularly don't play our instruments, don't understand just how much the proper key or improper key can affect the resonance of the instrument and the ease or not of the technique and how well we play. So now you're playing all original keys what Bach wrote. Is that correct? And so,
yes.
But Brad, you're transposing, right? Moving into different keys.
Yeah, I actually transposed the first 5 suites up a fifth. So the first one that's in G, I play in D, etc. So except for the last one, so I play the 6th suite in its original key in D. And so it was interesting when you were talking about the violist who played the last suite in the key of G being in that case, the first suite and the last suite in the same key. I'm doing the same thing on guitar, but everything's up a fifth. I've tried to play them in different keys where to try to stick with the original, but it doesn't work very well on guitar. Sometimes the range would be a problem if I transpose the last one. It's too high; it goes beyond our fingerboard. But just a tessitura, they sit. Sometimes in really awkward places. So anyway, I transpose them all up a fifth, except for the last one.
I think you're doing what Bach might have done. So you mentioned before that the suite number 5, which for cello is in C minor, exists in a lute version, which, if listeners don't know, that's transcribed in G minor. So it's transcribed in a key that's appropriate for that instrument. But there's many, many examples like that. So for example, from the violin sonatas and partitas, the violin partita in E major, sorry, I can't sing that high. That same movement is used as a sinfonia, as like an overture for one of the cantatas, and that's in D major. Many pieces by Bach exist in different versions and sometimes in different keys for particular reasons. And surely Bach would want his music to sit idiomatically on different kinds of instruments when he reuses that. That's something he did very often. Yeah, similarly, I mentioned that the violin pieces, we know he used them with his students on keyboard. Another reason we know that is because there are manuscripts that were copied out by students of his of keyboard arrangements of some of the violin pieces. I think, if I have it right, the A minor sonata for violin exists in a version in G minor for keyboard. I don't know the reason for that change of key. I don't know if J.S. Bach was involved with that or just his students. But if his students are doing that, probably that reflects practice that existed within his teaching or within his circle.
Yeah.
So Was the cello that popular an instrument during the Baroque era? In my little pea brain, I keep seeing a viola da gamba, as opposed to a cello. So why the cello? Anybody?
Ed, I think that's that
I think that's Ed.
Well,
Yeah,
maybe I can take a first crack at that and we can hear other
please
thoughts.
do.
Bach's lifetime was a time when the viola da gamba, the French viol family, was somewhat in decline, and the violin family, the Italian violin family, was on the rise in terms of prestige, in terms of importance. And there's plenty of solo violin music, including unaccompanied violin music written by Bach's precursors. During Bach's lifetime, the cello, for instance, in Bologna, there was a lot of music being composed for cello, cellos with different tunings, cello as a solo instrument, including as a virtuoso instrument, even including unaccompanied cello. We don't know if Bach knew any of this music. There are folks who will say, well, clearly this is where the idea for the cello suites came from. Possible. Of course, Bach, there are different opinions about how likely he is to have been exposed to that. Let me just put it that way. But probably in Bach's orbit, I think it's fair to say the cello was an instrument mostly used for accompaniment, mostly used for bass lines, often in parts that didn't even specify cello. So something might say basso, and you could play it on cello or on gamba or on bassoon. So it's an interesting question. Why would Bach write these virtuoso pieces for cello? It might be that if his idea was this is a two-part collection, meaning the violin sonatas and partitas, the manuscript says first book, libro primo. And the question is, what was meant as the second book? Maybe, probably, the cello suites were conceived of as the second part of this collection. Maybe Bach's idea was you'd have the first book is for the treble instrument in the violin family, and the second book is for the bass instrument in the violin family. And then there are folks out there who will tell you, well, which kind of cello did Bach have in mind? There were various instruments called cello in his lifetime that were various sizes. And the most extreme idea, some people will tell you, is there was this instrument called violoncello da spalla. That means basically shoulder cello. Yes, like played basically like a very large violin or viola. So you could think of it like a consort of instruments. Like if you play alto saxophone, you also know the fingerings for tenor saxophone. If you play violin, you also know viola. Well, then viola da spalla would be a version that the same player could play. There are folks who will tell you this is surely the instrument Bach composed for because it's an instrument he would have known how to play. But there's other folks who say, no, viola da spalla was so large, so unwieldy, that it must have been an instrument used more for bass lines and accompaniment rather than for virtuoso pieces like the cello suites. But there are recordings people are making reviving this instrument and making a case that this is, for someone like me who wants to play in the register of a cello and with the depth and resonance of a cello, that's as good as I can get without having to learn to play a totally different kind of instrument.
Well, let me ask also, Inbal, specifically, coming from the Baroque era and a Baroque, presumably a Baroque instrument, we're also looking at Baroque technique. We're looking at probably a different bow, and Baroque bowing, as I recall, is underhanded rather than overhanded. Is that correct? Does that affect anything? Does that something that you embrace, or just sort of give a nod to and let it go?
Playing on a period instrument is, I would say, part of the learning process when you're learning these. It is really good to experience what it might have sounded like. So it'll be a different kind of bow, different bow length, different kind of bow hold. That's a whole another can of worms there. Gut strings instead of metal strings.
Right.
Yeah, a lot of things in this, and no end pin actually.
Oh, that's right. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
Need a thigh master.
I think it's a good part of the learning process in order to actually try to see what kind of sound you would have had you been playing on a period instrument. Yeah, that said, I'm not playing on a period instrument, and so I try to take advantage of what my instrument has. I've said, those instruments had, some beautiful qualities, and they also had their limitations. Who knows if Bach was living now? Maybe he'll be like, oh my gosh, the steel strings are the best, right? So there's so much that we don't know that to say that one version is correct, I think is incorrect.
Well, I know that I know that
Yeah.
I play lute music on a guitar, and I have
Yeah.
little or no desire to. I mean, I've played upon a lute a couple of times. Played with a
Right.
lute. I won't say that I played lute. I played around with one, and it was just about long enough to realize that I prefer my guitar, and I prefer a modern guitar. Thank you very much. I'm assuming that that was kind of the same thing there. So
Yeah, I mean, so it gives you an idea of the sound quality that you might want to aspire to, and or things you might want to avoid, or maybe what might have been more idiosyncratic for bowings and things like that. But like I said, that said, what we're working with is not the same instrument, and we try to make it sound as good as possible on that one.
so
Right.
now we barely touched on this. So I want to kind of get after it a little bit. Each of the suites is made up of six movements, six pieces. That includes a prelude and five dances, I believe. Is that Ed? Is that all six of them? They all have a
Yeah,
prelude.
each of them. So, for instance, in the keyboard suites, the English suites, the French suites, some of them are written like the cello suites, beginning with a prelude. Others of them are written beginning with an allemande. The kind of core dances of a Baroque suite would be allemande, courante, sarabande, gigue. But then there were these modern dances or optional dances. Often they called them galanteries. So think of like the galant style. That means they were a little bit more up to date, dances that were still danced more in Bach's lifetime. And
Uh-huh.
so those are the ones he puts in the penultimate position. So those would be the minuets, the bourrées, and the gavottes. So that's how you get a total of five dances plus a prelude, total of six movements for each suite.
And my understanding is that people didn't really dance to these anymore. That it became a form, but it really wasn't a practical dance. I mean, like today, if I write a
Yeah,
waltz, I know that somebody can waltz to it, for example. But
you're right that these dances had become sort of stylized in the same way that, if you hear a Haydn symphony with a minuet movement, you're probably not going to stand up and dance. So there's a difference between the art minuet and the functional ballroom minuet,
uh-huh.
or a minuet that would be used in ballet. That's especially true for the allemande, which had been out of date for a century before Bach. So that was very much an instrumental genre whose origins in dance were, far in the past. On the other hand, these are dance styles. So the idea might be that you would, well, one approach to playing will be to think in terms of the dance qualities. Maybe that points to a little bit of a steadier tempo than you might play in a different kind of a piece. Maybe that plays into ways you think about rhythm or phrasing for some musicians. But others might think of the dance as just an abstraction and approach them in different ways. I'm curious how Brad or Inbal think
I
about the
was I
dance
was going to
quality when you
ask
play these
Brad.
pieces.
You're up to your eyeballs in it right now. How's that whole dance thing affecting what you're doing?
I actually had a Baroque dance class when I was at Eastman working on my doctorate. And so we had to dance some of the different styles. And I learned to read French dance choreographies. And and so that doesn't by any means make me an expert on the dances, but I found it really fascinating to be able to try to dance them. And then the tempos that we play them at, I think seem to be rather different. Um, so my own personal approach to this is, I mean, I've done a lot of research on the different dances, and so you get a general sense of the tempo of each. But I try to look at the each dance as having a certain kind of character, and so the Allemande was German and kind of stately and sort of, I don't know how to say it, kind of plain almost. And then you've got the Courante, which is faster, the sarabande, which is slow and absolutely beautiful, and then the two galanteries, the minuets or whatever, are usually a bit more sprightly, and then finally a jig that's fast. And so, as far as dancing them goes, I don't worry about anybody getting up and dancing in the middle of one of my performances. It's happened, but it's usually young children. And they didn't know the dance steps to a jig or a minuet. So as far as how I approach the tempos, I listen to a lot of cellists and other instrumentalists play. I've done lots of research. I have danced a few of them myself, and then from there it comes down a little bit to what's practical for me to play. Also, I've heard a few people play some of the courants so fast on cello that I really couldn't even match those on a guitar unless I stripped away literally everything and played only single notes. And even then, they're hard. And some of the jigs too. And so, again, I just kind of go with what I feel like would work for me, taking into account all of the things I've researched and studied. But yeah, I don't have a set tempo for each one. And although in the recording process, I do have a tempo that I mark down that I know that I want to start at. So when I do multiple takes, I'm not starting one with a pulse at 100 and the next one with a pulse at 120 or something like that. But anyway.
Inbal, when you were recording, did the whole dance thing kind of affect how you approach the music?
So I think I look at the titles and the dances as an indication of the character, and it gives you an idea of maybe what kind of tempo is. But tempo is for me, it constantly changes. I think what I actually use most of the time is the concept of free but in tempo, which that was something that my old teacher Aldo Parisa would always say. Sounds like an oxymoron, but basically it means that there is some sort of pulse. Within that pulse, you have all the freedom. So I think the fact that it is a dance means that there has to be some sort of continuity in the pulse. And then within it, every time is different. And I think it possibly made it very frustrating for the recording engineer and producer when I was doing it because, if I had I didn't actually record tempos. I didn't check what tempo I was doing. I let the music do what it needed to do, and it might be, and again, it also changes depending on what is going on acoustically. If you're performing them, if you're playing in a church, you might need to play it slower to let it all the notes actually come out. If you're playing in a dry acoustic, you might need to actually speed it up. So there's that. Obviously, that's not in the recording situation. But like I said, it made it a bit frustrating. It meant that I actually ended up having to usually take entire takes because to actually have it make sense both in terms of tempo and musically where it was going. Yeah.
So Inbal has this absolutely wonderful recording, and I can't. Honestly, I don't think I could recommend it more. It's a beautiful, beautiful recording. So with that in mind, and also with Casal's recording in mind, if we can kind of set those two recordings aside for a moment, do you each have another recording that you might recommend to anybody who happens to be listening or watching? Brad?
Yeah, if I go to that space, then my first influence was the first Yo-Yo Ma recording, which I don't remember when it came out, maybe in the 80s. And I loved the sound of it at that time. And then he recorded it twice more. And then, so I listened to the third one a couple of years ago, and I found that to be maybe more beautiful than the first one. It's a lifetime of discovery of this music, and so he's changed as a person, and so the music changed, and I liked the third one more. I felt like it was more emotional, and so I like those two recordings. And then when it comes to guitar, one of the reasons why I started doing my own recordings is that there are only a couple of people that I know of, I believe 3, who have actually recorded all 6 suites and done their own transcriptions. And of those, Marcos Diaz does a really beautiful job in both recording and in his arrangements. And so I really like that one for guitar. It's a guitar recording, of course. So yeah, I don't have as many, probably nearly as many references for the cello as Inbal has. I'm sure she's listened to a fun. Yeah, but yeah, the Yo-Yo Ma one for me. Probably the third one.
Inbal, you want to jump in there?
Oh wow, it's a hard one. I think I can't say that there's one particular recording that I would say is the one that you all have to listen to. I think listen to all of them because each one of them has something special, and each one of them might give you some ideas of something that you want to do. I mean, every one of them, the differences are so wide in terms of just concept of sound, concept of how to phrase. So I think in trying to figure out what you want to do, and you kind of listen to these and find out what the possibilities are. I'll say actually one of the things that I do love, and I love that I had the experience of playing in it, and I also love the recordings, are the cello ensemble versions of. There's the Sixth Suite Sarabande, and actually there's cello ensemble versions of the Fourth Suite that Laszlo Varga did, and I think that one also is in G major. It's anyways, actually being able to hear some of it. Just, I mean, what's better than one cello? I guess 20 cellos, right? So, but I think I did this with Aldo Pariso, and just the range of colors and range of sound that you can get when you have that many cellos, I think gives us something to aspire to with the one as well.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe I can start by recommending a website. I'll double check this before you finalize the video, but I think it's bachcellosuites.co.uk, and it's a website that reviews and describes many, many, many recordings. There's maybe something like 300 albums out there, and maybe you'd read their descriptions or reviews of maybe 100 of them. And so you could go there to see, well, which one's the best. But another way to put it is go to see how someone hears them, or what's one that could be interesting, including ones that were made in different decades. So how were people thinking of these pieces in the 1950s versus in the 2020s is interesting. You could hear the first performance ever made on a Baroque cello, or the first performance that ever used a 5-string instrument for Suite Number 6, if you're curious about that. For me, encountering performances on Baroque cello were very eye-opening. So for me, the first I heard was by the Dutch, the late cellist Anner Bilsma, who's someone who I think has a lot of interesting ideas to offer. I think he's recorded them twice, so I'm not sure which of those was the one that I heard first. There's a French cellist, Jean-Guyen Queyras, Queras, who's someone who I think plays them in a very interesting way. But boy, is it tough to choose one. I agree with Inbal that sometimes I had a teacher who said, it's like you have to bump into the wall to know how big the room really is. Maybe you have to listen to the recording that's the fastest one there is, or that's the most singing one there is, or the most dance-like one there is, or that maybe approaches the chords with the most on cello, we don't really play all the chords at once the way you might on a piano. So that there's a lot of choice to be made in exactly how you express the bass line in relation to the other notes. And boy, can it be interesting to see what's even possible. Paolo Pandolfo, if I have his name right, plays them on a gamba, which is interesting. There are some really beautiful recent recordings on violin, including Baroque violin and modern violin. So it's just wonderful. There's so many possibilities.
So at this point, what I would like to do is just kind of do a free-for-all. Is there anything that you guys would like to talk about or ask one another? It doesn't have to go through me. Any questions or any topics that we didn't, or any parts of this that we didn't touch on? Not to put you on the spot or anything. No.
It's back to that, the room is so big, you never do sort of bump into the sides. There's so many things to think about. I always wonder why this music is so timeless and why so many people love it. What do you think it is about this music that makes it so unique and timeless like that compared to other pieces? Anybody want to jump in on that?
I will for a second. I know that there's something about Bach's humanity that just absolutely screams through all of his music. And you can play just a little piece. You can play a little prelude, or one of his little study pieces, and compare it to his contemporaries, and it's like Bach and everybody else to me. There's just something about it. So for me, the cello suites just draw me in, and I think part of it is the storytelling that we talked on earlier. So anybody else want to touch on that?
I'm a musician and I'm also a historian. So I think of that question maybe in two different ways. One is there are some qualities the music just has, what it feels like to play, what it feels like to listen to, that are enriching, and that's what you're speaking to. And it can also be hard for us to separate like that from what we know about the history of these pieces and how people have come to talk about them. I think there's always been an air of mystery around these pieces
Hmm.
because Bach wrote solo violin pieces as part of a tradition, but solo cello is like a big question mark. Why the cello and which kind of cello? What kind of cello sound? Use the word humanity, that made me think of this other aspect of the cello suites history, which is that they've often been used as expressions of humanitarianism or of peace advocacy. So I'm thinking of Rostropovich, the Russian cellist, playing them in Berlin as the Berlin Wall fell. There's famous archival video of that. Yo-Yo Ma played them, for instance, during COVID. Played them after he got his vaccine. You have to wait for 10, 15 minutes. And he played the cello suites for the care workers there. He also played them at the US-Mexico border. Some years ago, there's a children's book about that called Playing at the Border. Also, he's played them in protest outside the Russian embassy during the war in Russia and Ukraine. There's a Ukrainian cellist and videographer who made a video called In the Streets of Kharkiv. So here you hear the Stark C minor suite performed by a cellist all by themselves in the bombed out, bombarded streets of Kharkiv that went viral a few years ago. And the question you might ask is why the cello suites and not, say, the violin sonatas and partitas? Why not the lute suites? Why not
Right.
maybe a cello is more portable than a piano is? But I also think a cello looks like a human and has a
Mm.
sound that might sound like a human, deeper, soulful. So is it this history, or is it intrinsically the sound, or some combination of both is part of why these pieces have come to have these special resonance?
Wonderful.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I think I go with what you were saying, Ed. That the cello is the closest to the human voice. It's and yeah, actually the shape of it too, and also I think the image of. I mean, one of the things that I was going to say was that these are pieces that you can play for yourself in a room, and you play for your soul. And you can play for an audience, and there really doesn't have to be very much understanding of what classical music is or anything to connect with them. There's
Mhm.
a simplicity and a complexity all at the same time that I think just makes you sit and listen. Um,
Mm.
and and yeah, so I think yeah, that image of and it's the one person and sitting there alone. I think is a
Well,
it's a
thank
direct
you
connection.
everybody
Yeah.
for taking the time out of your busy lives to do this. This was for me. This was a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed this, and it's I have the I guess the advantage of being the dumbest guy in the room, so I have to prove myself. But you guys are so good, and I appreciate your generosity of your time and your knowledge. And so I'm going to say goodbye to Inbal Megiddo and Edward Klorman and Brad DeRoche, and hope we get a chance to do something like this again soon. Thank you, guys.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Inbal Megiddo, Edward Klorman, and Brad DeRoche for taking the time to come on the show. If you'd like to know more, you can find a link to their websites in the descriptions below. I'd like to thank you too for taking the time to listen. If you enjoy these podcasts, please share your favorite episodes with your friends and introduce them to Creative Conversations with Roger Humphrey.